have this friend, he's probably my longest term friend, and we grew up down the street from each other. And his parents had in this closet in the guest room, this closet that was just chock full of clothes. But there were these clothes that they'd been saving from basically forever. And we looked at this as a vast storehouse of Halloween costumes, a wardrobe for making stupid movies with his dad's video camera, things to wear to school every once in a while when you wanted to rip off your jacket and wear something that looked ridiculous. But his dad, we asked him about it, we're like, why do you keep all this stuff? And he had this simple answer. He said, everything old becomes new again, and this is going to come back into style. Well, I can pretty much assure you that his striped polyester shirt from 1971 is probably still in that closet waiting to be stylish again. But he did have this idea that anything old becomes new again, that what goes around comes around, that fashion comes back into style. But we all know that it's true and it's not true, that there are these circular patterns of things that are stylish and are fashionable. But we also know that nothing ever comes back exactly as it did in the past. As a matter of fact, we know that we live in a world where things are always changing. You know, the first philosophical question ever was by a Greek guy. His name was Heraclitus. And his first question that was ever recorded in philosophy is this: can you ever step into the same river twice? What he means by that is, the water in the river is flowing. Different fish are swimming by. There are different plants living beneath the surface. There are different stones that are pushed along by the flow of the water. And everything over time changes and becomes different in time because the water on the surface is moving. So can you ever step into the same river twice? Even when you step into the same spot, the river itself is different and new and renewed because time has gone by. It's the same thing with all sorts of things, that we can step into the same place, we can do the same thing, but it's not exactly the same as it was before. I actually think our passage this morning is a passage that is addressing this question of how do we deal with the changes in the world? What does it mean to experience something old but experience it anew? And as I was thinking about it this week, I was thinking about this table that's in my kitchen. Jen and I bought this table about 16 years ago, and we bought it at a small antique store in Ohio. Now, you hear antique store, you think this was a fancy, expensive table. No, we bought it because it was cheap, and it was solid, and we knew it would serve our purposes. I mean, it has some idiosyncratic pieces to it. For example, it has these gold casters that were probably put on in about 1983. You can't really see them there, but they're on there that help it roll around. And then there's the center leg, which is from a table that must have been made in like 1974, because when you open it all the way up, it will sag in the middle if that table's not situated just right. And to really make it work, you have to put like a deck of cards under it because it sits a little high. And then originally it had, I think it was 4 leaves you could put in the table. And there are leaves, but they're new, so they don't actually match the wood that you see on that. They're much lighter. I actually think this is red oak, and they made those out of white oak. And it looks totally different. But yet, this table has been really an important piece in our house for a long time because we used it. And as I think about this table, I think about how something old can become new again. And why I think about that is every once in a while when I'm sitting at that table or looking at that table, I think about where it came from and when it was made. I'm pretty sure it was made in the 1870s, and I'm almost certain it was made in northern Ohio. And I'm also almost certain that it sat at an old farmhouse in northern Ohio. And I sometimes like to sit and imagine the people that sat around that table. I imagine that they would come to that table and sit around it after a day of hard work out in the farm fields. And they would gather for a meal that was made by hand. And they would sit around that table, and there would be laughter, and there would be tears, and there would be conversation. And there would be children who sat at that table who started out very small and grew up to be old and moved out. And eventually that table went off with someone else. And then in addition, when you look at the surface of the table, every once in a while I look at the surface of the table, and there are marks that were on that table when we bought it. There are indentations and little scratches and things like that. that have been there for, I like to imagine, 100 years. But then there are new marks and indentations and scratches and Sharpie things and pieces of glue, which are usually accompanied with some sort of angry word from their father about how they got there. But there's these new marks that have been left on this table. But as I think about this table, I think about how this table is an old thing that has become new, and it becomes new because it's used, because we've lived with it, because it shows the marks and the signs of being carried through the crucible of life. On that table, there are marks from me and from Jennifer and from our kids. And I have this hope for this table, that one day this table will be sent off pretty soon with one of our kids to be maybe the table in their college room, their college apartment. And hopefully it will survive that. We'll see. But then I imagine that one of them will take this table and they'll bring it to their house, and it'll be their first family dinner table, and yet it will have life breathed into it again. There's this sense that old things can be made new, but old things are made new not simply by refinishing and refurbishing them, but by their use and by the way that they experience new life. I imagine the person who built this table could never have envisioned how much time there would be computers and cell phones sitting on it. I don't think they envisioned that we would use it to serve Korean food and Indian food and not simply meat and potatoes that came from the farm. But yet I hope that in some way they'd be happy that this table's not been chopped up for firewood, but instead is being used as a place for laughter and crying and work and life. Old things do become new. In our passage in 1 John this morning, we're talking about how something old is becoming new again. And John's telling us how that happens. If you remember a couple weeks ago when I talked about the beginning of 1 John, I told you that John and his companions had gone and they'd shared the gospel in these several communities. And they went and shared the gospel in these different communities, and people received it, and these churches started, and there was this teaching, and this teaching was rooted in history about the person of Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And they believed that, and they believed that the historic person of Jesus Christ mattered, and they believed because they believed in him, they believed in all that came before him, in the law and the prophets, and they tried to live this out in their daily lives, and they saw this deep connection between the history of God that came to this point in Jesus Christ where things were most clear, but yet it goes back and it looks back to being obedient to God's commands and trusting God's work in the past was leading up to this point. So they left, and they left these churches in the hands of capable leaders, and in time, there were other teachers that came. And these other teachers that came told them that what they'd been taught before wasn't enough, that it's not about the historic Jesus Christ, but it's actually about this new knowledge, that everything old should be left behind, and anyone who believed that old stuff should be simply left behind. And instead, there's this new, deeper understanding that God's people are marked, they said, by a deeper personal understanding that's untethered from the historical Christ. Well, what happened was John and his companions found out about this, so they wrote to these communities. And one of the things they wrote is this first letter of John. And in this passage, he's reminding them that when it comes to following Jesus Christ, they have a point of decision, where they have to go one way or the other. They can go one way and they can follow this new knowledge, but he tells them that this will lead you astray and it will lead you out of fellowship not only with one another, but with God himself. And then he tells us there's this other way you can go, which is where you embrace what God has taught in the past and it's made new in and through you. And he writes this, his argument to them is fascinating. He says, now, by this we may be sure that you know him, if we obey his commandments. What's fascinating to me about this argument is that I'm sure that John was quite capable of sitting down and listing all the arguments of his opponents and listing his arguments and picking their arguments apart one by one. But what he doesn't do is he doesn't pick every argument apart. Instead, what he does is he tells us that you will be known by your obedience to God's commandments. In some sense, he says, look, the proof is in the pudding. The evidence is in your living it, not in your knowing it. Sometimes I'm afraid that in the Christian church we overvalue our understanding of things. And I realize that I'm guilty of this. I'm as guilty of this as anybody because I like to understand things. I like to know things. I like to have answers. But sometimes I think that we believe that having the right answer is enough. But the scriptures teach us again and again that you can have the right answer, but if your life doesn't reflect the truth of the answer, if your life doesn't reflect the love of God that overflows to the whole world, then all the knowledge in the world is of little value. What John isn't subtly telling them is he says, you might know every answer, but you don't know the Lord if you don't follow his commands. It's really a call to radical obedience. In this passage, there's also something rather intimidating. Because in this passage, it says that if you are in the light, you will walk as he walked, and he is Jesus. You will walk as Jesus walked. Your life will look like his. Your life will be patterned after and reflect the very life of Jesus. And if you hear that, if you're like me, it's daunting, it's intimidating to imagine that our lives will actually be like Jesus because, we have this narrative that we give ourselves that none of us can ever measure up. And while that's certainly true, I think sometimes we use it as an excuse. We imagine that since we know we'll never measure up, we won't even start and we won't even try. But John challenges us to think about what it would mean for our lives to look like Jesus Christ. What would it look like for our lives to be patterned after him? It's then that he turns to this strange little part of the passage where he says this. He says, "Beloved, I'm writing you no new commandment, but an old commandment that you have had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word that you've heard. Yet I'm writing to you a new commandment that is true in him and in you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining." What is this old commandment that's a new commandment? The old commandment that's a new commandment is this: love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your strength, and your soul. And the second is like it: to love your neighbor as yourself. In these, Jesus says, hang all the law and the prophets. What John is telling these churches is this: you need to remember this old command of God, to love God and to love your neighbor. And this is the summary of the whole Christian life. But he also calls this a new command, that we are to love one another. So in what way is it a new commandment? Here's how I think it's a new commandment. It's a new commandment in the sense that anything that is old that becomes new is something that becomes new because it's used, because it's tried, because it's lived with and lived out. That it becomes new in our experience and in our living of it. That this commandment comes to life when we live it out. In some ways, it's sort of like relationships. When you think about relationships, they start in one place, and if you're in a relationship for a long time, they change and they morph over time. And it doesn't mean that your love has ended. It just means that it's expressed differently. And think in particular of if you've ever had children. Now, if you ever have children, what happens is when your baby's born, if you read the experts, they tell you there's this process of attachment that happens, which absolutely does happen. And the process of attachment is different when your child is an infant than when they're an adult. When your child is an infant, what you need to do is you need to hold your baby and have that contact. You need to make sure they're clean. You need to change their diaper. You need to change their clothes. You need to feed them. You need to take care of their most basic needs. And in doing that, you begin to form this bond of love and attachment. To be honest with you, when you have a baby, that's how you show love. You take care of the baby's most basic and ordinary needs. But as that child grows, you still take care of the child's most basic and ordinary needs, but they change over time. When your child's 5 years old, hopefully you aren't changing diapers anymore. Sometimes you might be. But you do other things, like you make sure they eat, you make sure they get to school, you make sure that they're learning, you care for them, you play with them, you do these things because that's what love requires. And as your child gets a little bit older, say 14 years old, You do what love requires. You feed your child, you clothe your child, you drive your child around to soccer practices and games and friends' houses and all these sorts of things. You sometimes give advice and hope they listen to it because that's what love requires. And when you have a child who's 18 and graduates from high school and is getting ready to go off to college or go on to some beginning of their career, what you do is you listen to them and you talk to them and you hopefully impart some wise advice. And many times what happens is you function as a backstop as they begin their first tentative steps out into the world. But you're there for them and you care for them and you cheer for them because that's what love requires. And I'm not at this point yet, but I imagine that when your children are adults, you step back a little bit further and you watch them and you cheer for them. And when things don't go well, you cry with them. And you hold them when things fall apart and you cheer them on when things go great. And even still, you function as some sort of a backstop when things don't quite go right. And you do that because, well, that's what love requires. I think in this passage what John is saying is this old commandment to love God and love neighbors is something you've heard so many times before. But it becomes new when you live it out. It becomes new when you express this love in the world. It's given new life. In some odd way, it's kind of like my kitchen table. You know, it's something that was created in a different age, but it still has its purpose. It still is used for what it was intended, but it's used in the modern context where things are just a little bit different. When we think about God's command to love, N.T. Wright said that if Moses read 1 John, saying this is an old commandment, new commandment, Moses would go to everyone who was listening. He would say, that's exactly right. It's this old commandment, we're to love God and to love neighbors, but it's something that becomes new because it's a new commandment that's given every day for us to love God and love our neighbors. And how do we do it? Well, that depends, doesn't it? It depends a little bit on the context, doesn't it? We love God and love our neighbors in different ways, and we do what love requires. Sometimes love requires that we give with no expectation of getting anything in return. But we do it because as followers of Jesus Christ, we do what love requires. And sometimes it means that we hold people accountable for things that they said they would do because that's what love requires. Sometimes it means that we tell people about sin that's wrecking their lives because we want them to know the wholeness of following the Lord, and that's what love requires. Sometimes it means giving generously because that's what love requires. Sometimes it means rejoicing with those who rejoice and weeping with those who weep because that's what love requires. Sometimes it means walking silently with someone who suffers because there's no words that can express what needs to be said, so you're just there because that's what love requires. When we hear this old command to love our neighbors as ourselves, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and your mind and your soul and your strength, it's an ancient, ancient word. But it's also a new command every day. And when we live it out, we breathe life into this commandment. When we live it out, we see how it's renewed day by day in us. When we live it out, when we try out this commandment in the crucible of everyday life, we see the depth and the richness of God's love for us and for the world at work in us and through us. What happens when something old becomes new? It's given new life. It's something that inhabits us. It's something that gives us strength. It's something that gives us clarity. It's something that helps us to live our lives in service to the Lord. Let us pray.